by Thomas himself about the power of music. This session is the title, What Truths Are Conveyed Through Stories? So the importance of storytelling in communicating. Obviously, like music, it's a fundamental human feature. We love to hear stories. We like to know how they come out. We start to think about them. And that's, of course, exactly what's needed for climate change. So we have three really superb and wonderful panelists. Let me briefly introduce them. Then we'll let each one of them take a few minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, for introductory remarks. And then we'll start what will, I'm sure, be a lively discussion. So first panelist, Lorraine Boisseno, and I hope I haven't mispronounced that too badly. She's a freelance journalist and fiction writer. Contributing writer for the digital side of Smithsonian Magazine. Previously, she was assistant travel editor at the Weather Channel, and she also covers science and travel. She has received fellowships from the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources and the National Tropical Botanical Garden. Her work was shortlisted for the Peter Lisagor Award, as well as the Chicago Book of the Year Award. First narrative nonfiction book called The Last Voyageurs was published by Pegasus in April of 2016. Lorraine's stories have been published by The Atlantic, Playboy, Hakai Magazine, Mental Floss, Chicago Magazine, Salon, Forbes, Gistor, if I may pronounce that acronym, City Limits, The Morning News, Past Blue, and others. And very importantly, in addition to working as a journalist, Lorraine is a sailor. She's a francophone. I think we all know what that means. Native of the Great Lakes region, part-time explorer, animal lover, and fiction writer. Second panelist is Kirsten Hedegaard. She's director of choral and vocal activities and senior lecturer at Loyola University in Chicago.
George, sorry, she's later. I think.
Oh, I've got the wrong. Sorry here. You may have to help me out. Let me go to the third panelist, Shanna Yetman, freelance fiction writer, communication specialist, School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola. Shanna's fiction has most recently appeared online in Moon Park Review and The Daily Drunk. Her micro literature, Climate Migrants, has been longlisted in Reflex Fiction's Winter 2020 competition. Her story, The Miracle Is to Walk This Earth, was the winner for the New Millennium Writings 39th competition for flash fiction. And she is the 2014 recipient of Chicago Individual Artist Grant Program. Shanna has a BA in English from Wellesley, an MFA in fiction writing from University of Maryland at College Park, currently works at Loyola as the communications specialist for the School of Environmental Sustainability. And Thomas, you're going to have to help me out with introducing our third panelist.
Haven't we gone through all three?
Okay. Thomas, I can introduce myself if we need to.
Yeah, why don't we do that? That would be true. I'm so sorry for this mix-up.
Who's more of an expert, right? Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with Lorraine and Shanna, and my name is Kimberly Garza. I'm a fiction and nonfiction writer. My debut novel, The Last Karankawas, will be out next year from Henry Holt. And it centers on some of the things that I'll talk about later and an excerpt of it that was given to y'all. I write primarily about Texas. I was born and raised here. I'm coming to you live from San Antonio, where it is not nearly as hot as it has been in the last couple of weeks. My work has been published in places like Creative Nonfiction and in Cutbank, in Bennington Review, and nominated for Pushcarts. And I'm currently an assistant professor of creative writing in the English department here at University of Texas, San Antonio.
Fantastic, Kimberly. Thank you so much for that. And let's start with the introductory remarks. Lorraine, would you like to go first? And then Kimberly, if you don't mind, and Shanna.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction, George. And thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to all of you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the different ways that nonfiction writing can be used to convey different types of information about the environment and climate change. So if you've gone through the pieces that I sent, one was a reported series about a proposed copper mine, and one was more of an essay just about like neighborhood observations of the interactions between humans and birds. And I picked those two things because I think that it would be a mistake to say that nonfiction writing comes in just one form. Obviously, the style that most people are most familiar with is journalism. And that is my main type of writing. That's what I do as my job. So when I'm approaching those types of stories, my goal is generally to collect data, anecdotes, different perspectives of people on different issues, and create the most comprehensive picture of a particular issue for readers to be able to understand what might be at stake. I think what is really hard in journalism that doesn't potentially pose as many problems in other forms of writing is that journalists need to be some level of objective. I think people generally accept at this point that like no individual can come at any issue without bringing their own biases and perceptions to those issues. But we still want to not side with anyone unless it's specifically an opinion piece or an essay piece. And for this type of reporting that I did for the series on the copper mines, I didn't want to side with anyone going in, even if my personal values might be that, well, I support protecting the environment and this doesn't seem like a good way of doing it. So I think when I'm coming to those kinds of stories, I'm always going to have more skepticism for the industry and for anyone who stands to make a profit or be in a position of power from the projects that are going forward. But at the same time, I understand that the decisions that those people make will have an effect, and often positive effects, for people with less power and less privilege. And what I wanted to capture in that piece is that while there are, of course, many people arguing against those copper mines for different environmental reasons, for health and safety reasons, there are a lot of people who would like to have jobs in those industries because those jobs might be better paying than the jobs that they have now, because those jobs might be able to bring more infrastructure to regions that have been underserved, that don't have as good of internet access or well-funded schools, whatever the case may be. It's not as straightforward as saying we need to protect the environment, we need to protect the climate and do whatever we can to stop moving forward with extractive industries. There are a lot of reasons why people want those things to continue. And those reasons are not just, well, these corporations are rich and powerful and they want to keep making money. Those are undoubtedly one of the big reasons that corporations are pushing for it, but other people also have a stake in those kinds of projects. And we are also communicating on computers with technology. If we would like to continue having technology, some argue we need to continue mining and using extractive technologies to have those materials at our disposal so that we can have the technology that we rely on. So I can go into that in a lot more detail. I've covered different types of mines, but I've also covered pollution in other forms and environmental conservation. So I just picked that story as an example of one topic and how I covered it because it was a very long-term project. I think I spent 6 months researching and reporting that story before it was published. The other one I wanted to use as a contrast because I also find, as a reader and a writer, that it can be really effective to establish a personal connection with some element of the environment in whatever form that might take for different people in different places. And to me, that type of writing relies a lot more on tangible and emotional impact rather than the data and the possibility of impacts further down the line. So some of my favorite writers who do the more essayistic form are people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who writes about a lot of different environments that she's worked in. She has a PhD in botany, but is also Native and brings that tradition to her writing as well. And she writes in a way that connects more intense scientific material with a very personal, emotional story. And I find that to be a really great way of getting people to feel a personal connection. So I kind of think of writing about the environment in terms of big power structures and individual human connections. And those are both things that I want to bring to my work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Kimberly, if you don't mind, please.
Sure. I guess I'll take mine just a bit from what Lorraine said so nicely, which where she ends on talking about big power structures and individual connections as the way to look at environment. And I would say that I do something very similar, but I do almost exclusively the individual connections. So I write primarily fiction, and as I said, as I said previously, the heart of my work, I think, is place and setting. I'm really motivated by landscapes and cities and sort of environments, whatever that might mean, of where I am, where I've lived, and because of the life I've had, I've only ever lived in Texas, very vastly different parts of Texas, and different cities that have their own cultures and environments. I grew up in Southwest Texas, very close to where I am currently, very near San Antonio, and living in a place like Houston or Dallas or Austin is vastly different from living in the small town where I grew up. And so I love examining not just landscape, but we all know by nature of what it is, what the world we're living in, we're constantly affected and impacted by environment and environmental change specifically. And in my work, I think because it's fiction, I'm sort of getting at identity struggles and people's struggles that are defined and shaped by where they find themselves, whether they were born and raised here, whether they're immigrants, whether they're transplants. And I sort of look at those structures in the way that the reader can then kind of see the impact of bigger changes, political changes, governmental changes. Immigration is a huge part of my work as well. And of course, climate change. I'm writing my book right now, and the excerpt that I gave y'all deals with Hurricane Ike, which hit Galveston Island in Texas in 2008. And was completely devastating. And not very long after, the Houston area would be struck by Hurricane Harvey. And these are the storms are not new to the Texas coast, as I'm sure anyone from any coast can attest to. Storms are nothing new, but for whatever reason, they have picked up. We have seen a lot of huge weather changes in Texas in the last couple of years, in a state that is already very aware of how tricky and temperamental the weather can be. And we're just seeing environmental changes kind of stack up and stack forward. And rather than touching on the big movements of climate change or governmental politics and how pollution and how environmental structures can sort of help these things, I focus on the people, right? The people who are in these small places that are experiencing, a massive hurricane headed their way. And what do you do if you haven't lived a life of privilege, and picking up and moving is not something that you can do? So those tend to be the ways that I focus on environment as something really fused to place in a way it's inextricably linked, and how that impacts the people who exist in these spaces, whether they're from here and they're very used to it, whether they're new here. There's a character in my book who is a migrant worker and comes to work in Galveston, works on a shrimp boat, has no idea what to do about a hurricane, and everybody kind of keeps telling him, it's no big deal, like we just hunker down, and he's kind of, wondering what to do. And so that's sort of how I look at these big issues, is by focusing on the micro, right? Focusing on the people and who are just sort of living their lives and might have to deal with a massive Category 5 hurricane bearing down on the life that they know. So I thought that just because it takes a minute and a half to read it, I would read the very short piece that I sent y'all, which is nonfiction. Actually, this is an essay, a flash essay. It's a 1-sentence essay, if you picked up on that. My 8th grade English teacher will die if she saw how I use punctuation in this. But it really stems from my experience being from Galveston. I didn't grow up there. I was born there, but my mother's family, who were mostly immigrants from the Philippines, all sort of settled there. And so that's where my family made their home base. And the way the identity of the place changed for me really sort of sparked the beginnings of what would be this book. So I like to honor it. And also I just kind of like the energy of reading it out loud. And you'll hear some of the ways that I change it when I read it out loud and you don't necessarily have the text in front of you. So I'm going to read it right now. It'll be very quick, and thanks for bearing with me. And this is called The Seedy Corner. The house in Galveston in Fish Village on Albacore Avenue specifically is no longer yellow, but I will always think of it so. A pale milky yellow, like I imagine cream with a pat of butter stirred in to be. But that sounds so Midwestern, doesn't it? That cream and butter shit. And apart from one trip to Wisconsin and a friendship with some Minnesotans, I know fuck all about the Midwest. So instead, let's say it is a golden white like sunlight, why don't we? The scorching sunlight of the Texas coast that I know well, slanting down through the palm trees to leave sunburns in strange patterns across our young brown shoulders and the tops of our feet where we never remember sunscreen, but a golden white pockmarked by spotted brown snails. Smears of mud and tar that none of us kids know how they got there, but my dad says they're tossed by the sea breezes and salt air that move without our knowledge and often without warning, building steadily into terrifying organic forms like the hurricane that will finally force my grandparents out of this home and off this island in just over 15 years. But before that, this house still has the screen door that's worn, riddled with tears and gaping wounds in the mesh meant to be protective, but instead permitting those fucking resilient Galveston mosquitoes drawn to the white walls, white as pearls, not pearls like the nubby gray one I found once, prying open the hinge of an oyster my Theo from the valley procured from his buddy, a Gulf shrimper. Just a pebble, really, giving a gritty gravel scrape against my teeth, but pearls like rich women wear in movies set in New England, a place as exotic and foreign to me as Sierra Leone, pearls with a sheen of class and clean against that white to draw the eyes of men named Conrad or Jeffrey with a G. But these walls have no such sheen, and this white lures only mosquitoes and moths and a mess of other bugs through the screen door into my grandparents' home on this steamy island where I was born, where I spent holidays and summers and long weekends all my life until that hurricane, thinking this island, this city, this neighborhood of Fish Village, this sun-white house on Albacore Avenue was the ultimate vacation escape, because it's only 10 minutes from Stewart Beach and it's brown sand, its empty lifeguard towers of softly feathered wood that still splinters into the webs of our hands, its tar globs that we rub from our heels and ankles with baby oil before we put our shoes back on. And it's only 2 blocks from Lindale Park, where my cousins and I play half-hearted tennis for an hour before getting bored and spinning my sister on the merry-go-round until she screams. The park where we know not to be after 5 because the gangs come out. And we know not to wear red or blue at certain times of the day as we walk back quickly with our hands in Rosalinda's, her grip tightening when we cross the street, hoping that knot of teenage boys over there won't catcall so much. But they always do, because at 13, she already has C cups and the rest of us don't, but we are still female, still something to be snagged in the net of their eyes. And it isn't until Hurricane Ike sweeps into Galveston with the surge that floods the house, leaving an inky bruise on the white walls 4 feet from the floor, that takes so much construction and red tape to renovate that my family finally rents the home out and stays permanently in the neighborhoods over the causeway that they call nice, they call safe. And it isn't until I describe that house in Fish Village to my Houston native professor, and he nods and says, "That's part of the seedy corner, huh?" that I sit back and blink through his words, realizing where he thinks I am from, where I was all along, why the pizza delivery boy on the phone once heard us say Albacore Avenue and immediately answered with, "We don't deliver out there." Okay, thanks for listening, y'all.
Wow. Very, very nice. Thanks so much, Kimberly. With a lot there to think about and talk about. Let's see, Shanna, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, Kim, that was beautiful. I think don't they call that the breathless paragraph?
That's the case with me. Like, where do you strategically breathe?
It's hard to figure that out. You did a great job. So, Dr. Crabtree, we talked back in 2015 because you were the keynote speaker for Loyola's climate change conference.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
I know. And one thing you impressed upon me in that conversation was sort of the necessity for scientists to be able to communicate issues surrounding climate change, and communicate the innovative solutions as well. And I actually think that's really happening more now. Even our conference at Loyola has transitioned from an academic conference to one more concerned about the issues and the activists working on the ground to help prevent the worst of climate change. And then I think your keynote with Kim Miner is a perfect example of that. She's a climate scientist who can accessibly talk about the issues. I personally also think that art and fiction can do this. It provides a bridge from the big, lofty scientific issues to something that is more accessible to the general public. It's a different way of seeing. It is also, as e-viewing says, a way to think about other ways the world might be. And I think, that's kind of the work that that's the realm of the work that I do. I like to think about other ways the world might be. So at Loyola, just talking a little bit about artistic inspiration, at Loyola and at SES, I get to work with Dean Nancy Tuckman and a bunch of scientists and professors that have a wealth of knowledge around tons of issues surrounding climate science, environmental degradation, ecotoxicology, and I am able to glean a tiny, tiny bit of that information through our conversations and through the profiles I write for them in the annual report and our e-newsletter. And at SES, there's always a buzz of activity that surrounds that place, and it centers on helping students become successful environmental stewards. And the work being done at SES has kind of been a buoy for my fiction writing. As an artist and fiction writer, it lights up my brain all the time. There's so many issues that you get to play with and just think about. And the work that I do in my environmental fiction is twofold. One is the documentation of what it means to live in this era of the Anthropocene. How are we damaging the world? What stories and fictions are we telling ourselves to get by? What kind of reckonings might we have to come to? This is where I started when I first began learning about these issues at SES. And a lot of it was a direct response to writings by Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben. This is mostly what I do through flash fiction, and because it's short, it can almost be my call and response to modern day environmental issues. The other writing I produce is for longer projects, and it's more speculative in nature. And what would it be like to live in America when the sea levels rise? What if the planet can heal itself from the damage we are inflicting on it? Where are the rays of hope? What does that look like? And some of these ideas come directly from the science that's happening at SES even. I'm fascinated with this idea of bioremediation, where literally you can use plants to leach up chemicals and heavy metals, and they can clean the soil themselves. I mean, that's amazing. And I always feel like this is the planet healing itself. This is the planet taking care of itself. And personally, I also feel it's important as an artist to show positive ways out of our dilemma. So with climate change and heat islands and polar vortexes and sea level rises and wildfires, where can we go? What does it look like to begin, as Bill McKibben puts it, a graceful decline? What is the best way for us to rebuild our communities? And I mean, personally, it's not going to be with forever growth capitalism. So, we have to think about these issues and think about, and that can be the job of a fiction writer. So right now I'm going to read the beginnings of my short story, Its Own New Thing, which touches on some of the themes of changing systems that you guys have been talking about at SISE. It's in an anthology published by a little writers group in Winnetka called the Off-Campus Writers Workshop. It's probably about 5 minutes in length, so you could probably sit back and have a cup of coffee or something. Its Own New Thing. June 22nd, 2056. Atmospheric carbon dioxide, 250 parts per million. How are we going to be? My dad drones on, his red hair flopping wildly, his pale cheeks flushed. His eyes are bright. He makes sure to look many of us in the face, including me. I look at the ground. He makes me feel uncomfortable. Both my parents are bigwigs in the environmental evangelist movement, and Earth needs them, but I need them too. I shouldn't say this, but sometimes I hate this stupid planet. I wish we'd all just wash away with it, or it would just take care of itself. I sneak a glance at my cousin Brent and my Auntie Star.
Auntie smiles and points forward, reminding me that I should pay attention to Dad. When he speaks, I try to listen, honest, but his voice is so boring, and what's that word? Monotonous. We get to decide what's next. We get to be the founders of mankind's second act. Humanity needs new tenets. Few of his flock nod their approval. New rules for humanity? Boring. I feel better when I look outside. It's June and snowing. I love the way the snow falls on our glass dome, immersing us in an ice cave under a purple sky. According to my parents, it wasn't always like this. First, it was unbearably hot. Then it was unbearably cold, the planet's thermostat on the fritz. Once summers began to warm and the ice began to melt, Dad took this as a sign to settle. He decided he could do whatever Earth was calling him to do in one place, Chicago. There's still enough natural light to see the thick white birch trees and dense forests that run along either side of our building. I watch my mother. She sits next to Dad, taking notes, nodding or laughing at whatever marble comes out of his mouth. She's so full of energy. She winks at me and I sit straight. Auntie says she's the heart of this operation, but I think she says that because they're sisters and they have to boost each other up. Mom is rail thin with curly brown hair. She is glowingly beautiful. I think of her as a priestess, but really she's an ornithologist and even looks like a bird sometimes, at least in my mind. Of course, I haven't seen any real birds ever, but I've stared at plenty of the dead stuffed specimens in her office. Outside, the birches sway with the breeze and a few feral cats playfully assault each other. Inside, people are shedding their winter layers, snow pants on the ground, thick coats off, hats and gloves in disarray or hanging near our heat lamps. Everyone is settling in, getting excited. Many of them have spent their whole lives thinking about what we should have done to tread more lightly on Mother Earth. Lee, the meteorologist, he did morning news in Maryland way back when, mentions communal high-rise living, boring. Others offer up plant-only diets, bartering, massive reforestation, boring. They could talk this to death. I inch closer to the glass. We aren't that high up, and because of the way the snow is blowing, most of it has accumulated on the top and front of our dome, but the other side is snow-free. This is the side I'm sitting next to. The forest to my right is vast and the trees are tall, like they've been growing for 20 plus years, though we only planted this grove 8 months ago. Since then, they've taken over our neighborhood, growing faster than trees have ever grown before, our plant biologist reminds us. I look for the cats and notice only one. I turn to face my father once more. His whiteboard is full of lines, arrows, circles. He's numbering the best ideas. People are busy in their conversations. Most of them have gathered at the front behind the tomatoes. I can only see the back of heads. There's a tug on my braid. It's Henry. He's pimply-faced and fat, and I hate him, which he knows. So of course he's going to bother me. He's been looking outside and his eyes are big, like he's seen a ghost. He points. Did you see that? What, Henry, what? I'm annoyed, but also a little bit interested. There's nothing out there. Henry's lips are blue and open. His chest is heaving, becoming more erratic. If I didn't know better, I think he was having a heart attack. But that doesn't happen to kids, right? He pokes my neck and shoulders, turns me so the window's in front of me, tries to make sure I see what he sees. His voice is barely audible. He whispers in my ear, "Look, Lily, look." I follow his finger toward the forest. There's a bird-like creature the size of a toddler in plain sight. It looks like a grouse, or at least what I know of them from my mother. Even from this distance, I can see 4 long, sharp teeth protruding outside of its beak. I look back at my parents. The adults in this room are still occupied with mankind 2.0. Nobody is paying any attention to us. I take a step closer and learn quickly where the cat went. The thing is feasting on it. Tendons and sinewy muscles hanging from its beak. It shakes the dead animal confidently, and I watch as the cat's eyeballs dislodge, dangling from the lifeless body by the optic nerves. Ew. I don't look away though. There's something else. Every so often it stops eating and excitedly shifts its shape. Its back feathers go up and out, and its orange breast feathers create an iridescent smiley face. I've seen a version of this thing before. Looks like one of my mother's raggedy old early 20th century birds of paradise. The one she keeps trying to pin and prop up to get its transformation just right, to make it look real. Of course, her version is more twisted than this one. Her birds look like monsters. This animal is quite pretty when it struts its stuff, even if it does have guts hanging from its mouth. Thank you, guys.
Wow, really interesting. Lots here to think about. And thank all three of you really for the wonderful intros you guys have given about communication and how to really make it effective. There are a couple of comments in the chat, and maybe Noah, you posted actually the first one. Can I ask you to share that? And maybe this really goes to all three panelists.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, George. And thanks all the panelists for being here. So my question, earlier in the program, we talked about moral relativism. So that there isn't necessarily a fundamental truth. A lot of us disagreed with that. I was just wondering, do you guys feel a responsibility to express some fundamental environmental truths in your work?
That's a really good question. I can go first. If I do feel some responsibility to that, but it's really hard. It's a really interesting balance because you want to be true to the story and you want to be true to the characters and you want to be true to the writing, and you don't want to come out as being dogmatic or too ideological, because then that turns people off too. But I think where I can try to stick to the facts would be trying to present the most factual information possible. If I've been, reading up on the scientific research or talking to people who may know the science a little bit better, if I can try to present that information properly, which I'm still working on sometimes, you definitely like play with it a lot, then the message is going to get out there anyway.
Great answer. How about some other panelists? And I know it's a question, especially in journalism. I think you were mentioning that you have to be careful, and you're trying to be balanced. And is there a pull on you as you write that says, well, I really ought to be tilting toward the truth, as I understand it?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I think there are fundamental environmental truths that I definitely want to always convey, which is that, very broadly speaking, humans have a strong impact on the environment. Climate change is real. Like, I know that there's this perception, and I think it happens more maybe on television news, that there has to be like all sides represented, but the vast majority of environmental journalists, I belong to the Society for Environmental Journalists, a professional organization, are like, the science is like very, very, very well decided that climate change is happening and that it is related to human activity. So like, I'm not ever going to say like, oh, look at these yoo-hoos who are arguing otherwise. They deserve as much time and attention as everyone else. I don't feel that's my responsibility. If I were to say, why do they believe that? What is their interest? Is there a way we can convince them otherwise? Like, yes, that would be something that is not a story that I am interested in telling, but that is a story that I have seen told that is probably worth telling. But like fundamental truths, yeah, climate change is happening. We are responsible for it. We are responsible for a lot of the environmental degradation that we see all over the place, but also the fundamental truth that I want to convey is like, we are not separate from nature and the environment. We are part of nature and the environment. We are humans and we are animals. And whether we adapt to the changes that are happening because of our actions is kind of up in the air. Like, I do think I want to convey that there is reason to be hopeful. I liked what Shanna was talking about, that there are solutions that we're trying to create. I've done a little bit of work in solutions journalism, which is just like a broad term for, okay, here are all the problems, but here are tangible things that we are doing. And I think that is also important in talking about fundamental truths, that like, we're still here, we're looking for solutions, and some solutions might help. And at the same time, we have to adapt. So yeah, there is like a push and pull between what to say, but I'm never going to play devil's advocate or air beliefs that I know are false for the sake of balancing a story.
Really interesting answer. And Kimberly, if I can address this to you, when you're writing fiction, you have a little bit more freedom, as you pointed out, and you might want to deal with something other than the fundamental truths. You might want to deal with how people feel about things, emotions, and what motivates people, and the fact that there are many different points of view when it comes to climate.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you, George. I think that is exactly what I'm getting at when I like to present the space and the place of wherever the story is set, wherever the novel is set. One of the things that I enjoy the most is just the breadth and diversity of people who live in a place like Galveston, who live in a place like Uvalde, where I was born, where I grew up, and just in a massive place like Texas, as broad as that is, and there are so many people here, and there are so many people with different understandings, right? And if I called out, a Filipina nurse who worked in Galveston and had grown up elsewhere, and asked her what her fundamental environmental truth was, it would be very different, right, from a Tejano who's lived there since it was not Texas, right? It was Mexico. So I think when I like to present it, I look at, some of that journalism training comes in, and that I present the place the way it is, which is kind of bizarre enough, honestly. They're experiencing these increased severity in all kinds of storms, that the hurricane season is now not just like a whatever. It's a real thing that they're all sort of aware that they're going to get slammed. And it's a matter of time, which one is going to be the biggest one. And, in a place like South Texas, we didn't think we had to worry about winter weather, and apparently we do. We all just experienced this massive freeze, and our power grid failed, for multiple days. And so these are things, rather than, I think, like getting really attacky in my fiction, or really preachy, it might be the other word. I don't ever want to shout at the reader and be like, pay attention to this. Rather, I just like to describe, hey, this is the place. These are the things that people who live here are going through, and some of them pay attention and some of them don't, and some of them have the privilege of being able to like try to do something about it, and some of them don't. This is where we live, and we have to bear with it. And then I hope that impacts the reader, right? Wherever the reader is coming from, wherever you're reading this stuff from, that kind of shines a light on the bigger problems that are happening, and the ways that we could be impacting the environment, rather than just the environment impacting many of us.
Great answer, and that's worth a little bit more conversation. Maybe we want to follow up later in the hour. But I'd like to turn now to Adele, who had two comments in the chat. One about how being read to makes her feel. Adele, would you start with that? But then your second question, thoughts on trends in fiction writing. That it's growing. Well, I'll let you make your comment, but if Adele, please.
Sure. Yeah, I was responding to something Jennifer mentioned about how it was comforting and kind of nostalgic to be read to, and that was something that happened a lot in elementary school and middle school. So it was nice to kind of experience that again, and it was also really great writing too, so that was enjoyable. But my question was related to some of the trends that y'all have noticed in the fiction space with regards to dystopian and more apocalyptic novels. And I was curious if, in your opinion, that kind of gave any insight into the needs and motivations of today's society, and also if there were any other trends that you noticed, maybe cross-culturally, that were following like a similar trend to what's happening here.
I can try to answer some of that just initially. As some of you know who are in my Parable of the Sower reading group, that, certainly the dystopian novel, there's something that feels kind of right about this time period in modern society. whether it's governments failing, the environment getting harder and harder to live in, or just massive violence. And certainly in Octavia Butler's novel, that she sort of combines everything and gives you this sort of horrific dystopian novel. And there are a lot of dystopian trends out there right now, I think, for a variety of like political reasons as well, which is why I always in my work want to think about what kind of messages of hope can we bring along to, like where, because what are we if we're not going to be a hopeful species? Because you can just live through it, but if the main character in the parable of Sorrow says, I mean to survive. So, I mean to survive, and I want to survive in as hopeful of an environment as possible. But as far as sort of trends, I think what's different is that there's this sort of new genre, maybe not so new. It's called climate fiction. People call it cli-fi. Lorraine could probably speak a lot better to it, so I will cede the floor very soon. So there's a lot of speculative, there's a speculative nature to it. And it means that as many, we could think about the good technology aspects, and we can also think about the bad. And it's just kind of getting thrown together a little bit right now to great, interesting reads, really good stuff. I posted a list in the eco literature reading group. I can post that universally as well. But I will stop talking now and give it to somebody else.
Who'd like to pick up the thread?
I was just going to say, I'm aware of this trend and I love reading it. I have yet to try writing it. My fear is that, or the way I explain it to students, I teach a lot of creative writing students here in San Antonio, who are insanely creative with what they want to write. And the vast majority of it is either some kind of dystopia or even just fantasy in general. Some of them sort of veer a little speculative, where it's a little more rooted in like some kind of reality that we could recognize. Some of them are full on inventing worlds, and it's amazing. And they get stuck with like a fuddy-duddy professor who writes realism. But it's this fascinating, I'm aware that it's a trend. It's fascinating, it's beautiful. I have not tried writing it. I find that just for me, the act of creating stories in these places is, as I said, like bizarre enough. I'll write something and I'll have somebody mention like, God, that was crazy. And I'm like, I didn't even invent that. That happened. And I remember once when I was doing an interview for a lit journal that I worked for, I interviewed the great fiction writer Claire Vaye Watkins, whose last novel, Gold Famed Citrus, was all about, I would call it cli-fi. And she's from the West, she's from Nevada, and she wrote this novel that is set in this near future, a dystopian future where the West has run out of water, just completely run out of water. And so what happens to the refugees from California and Nevada who are trying to make it east, and people are kind of shutting them out. And I remember asking her, like, how did you come up with these small details about what happens to the land, what happens to the water, what happened to Hoover Dam. And she said every time she came up with something, she would do a little bit of research and find out that it had already happened, like something about the Hoover Dam failing. She mentions a moment in the book where the Hoover Dam fails, and she looked it up and she was like, oh, so that's already been a thing that's happened. I don't have to invent it. So I felt a little comforted by that, and that this really great speculative writer was saying, like, reality is just kind of giving me the things to work with. I'm not even inventing them at this point. So maybe someday I'll try it, but I'll defer to the minds who have.
It's amazing that truth is stranger than fiction, you might say. Everything is there. You don't need to invent. I have a question, actually, it's my own question. When you folks are starting to write something, or you're creating an idea, your next piece of writing, do you have something in mind that you want to convey? That's the first question. And the second part of that question is, how do you go about conveying it? And the context might be, of course, you might want to convey in a fictional piece, climate change is important. It's more important than most of us think. We ought to be thinking about it. And maybe a dystopian plot line or novel is one way to do that, that gets attention. On the other hand, you might want to be conveying, look, there are some interesting ways out of this. Let's think about them. And maybe we should promote them. They may be technological, they may be more sociological. How do we care about each other? And you know, when you're writing your next piece, what are you thinking? What's your motivation? What do you want to accomplish? Let anybody take a shot at that. But Lorraine, maybe are you willing to?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I think those questions are interesting because sort of what Kimberly was talking about that reality is weird enough. I honestly think you can get away with more in nonfiction than you can in fiction, because you're just like, well, but it's real, it happened. And in fiction, you have to create something that's convincing enough for the readers to have what we call suspension of disbelief, that they're not going to be jarred out of the narrative because something caught their attention in a bad way. They're like, oh, I don't buy this. Sure, there's flying cars, but tornadoes in Washington, no, like, you know, things like that. But I think, so going to the question of coming at stories with a goal in mind and then achieving that goal and coming up with new stories. In my journalism work, I do generally have a goal in mind when I'm writing a story, but I try not to have a straightforward narrative or point of view that I'm arguing for. Like if I did another piece several years back about wetland revitalization in Milwaukee and different ways that it was happening. And I came across that story because I was just interested in, is there a way for really dense urban areas to have wetlands that are really important habitats for a lot of reasons that have been degraded, bring them back in a way that's beneficial to the wildlife and also to humans, like it's not going to disrupt industry or neighborhoods or whatever. And so I wanted to explore that question, but without hoping for a particular answer, because like maybe the answer would be, well, this might be possible, but so we haven't done it the right way so far. Luckily, that's not what I found. It was a nicer story of like people did feel like more connected when they started taking better care of the wetlands, and it had a positive impact on several neighborhoods. But I don't want to go into a story expecting to find something, because if you want to find something, you can find it. I think in a way it's like testing a hypothesis in science. Like if you are looking for a certain outcome, you're going to skew your results potentially. And so I try to come at it with a goal and see what's out there. And I think similar things can be said for my experience of writing fiction. I might have a goal in mind when I start a story, but I never want that to be the point of the story. Like anytime you're trying to convey a message, if you get too caught up in the message, it becomes really didactic and kind of annoying to read. Like Upton Sinclair did a lot of great work, but also really annoyed a lot of people. And like, if you just tell people they need to eat their vegetables, they're going to be like, well, that's dumb. I don't like this. And so I think you have to be a little craftier with journalism and with fiction in getting people to engage with things more genuinely than forcing them to think about things a certain way or believe a certain idea.
Great answer. And we should all take that to heart, even in our technical writing, I think. Shanna, any comments?
Yeah, I was just going to echo all of Lorraine's comments. So fiction writing there's, this delicate balance. I always go in thinking like, I'm like kind of an ideas first person anyway. So I do think, what about climate change? And like, how is this going to affect X, Y, and Z? But then you really do have to back it up like 1,000 steps and say, well, if I portray this story, what are the characters? What are their motivations? What kind of characters would, if it's about climate change and loss of home, is there somebody who's obsessed with home? Like they just love being, their home is perfect and beautiful and pristine. And so you can see that like this issue might actually play with their actual needs or wants or desires. But you have to be really careful with that. And ultimately you have to literary fiction is always character first. So you have to find a truthful place to balance the ideas and the character first reality of fiction. So.
Great insight. Kimberly, anything to add?
No, ditto. No, I'm just going to pretend I said all of the things that Lorraine and Shanna said. I would say that when I write fiction, I'm almost exclusively character or place first. And to the point where I'll finish a story and I'll share it with, a workshop or a friend or an editor and be like, okay, this is a story about these people and like this stuff is happening. And then they'll send it back and be like, are you also aware that it's talking about immigration? Like, are you aware that it's talking about, gentrification? Are you aware about that's talking about these ideas? So I tend to see the ways in which that feels a little bit like cheating for me, but I like it. And that I approach it as saying, I'm not going to write about big issues. And they almost always bleed into my work because they're concerns, right? They're things that I'm thinking about and I'm not aware that I'm thinking about, or there are things that are happening in the world around me or in these places, and that they just sort of seep into the piece. So I trust that they're there. I trust that they'll be there and that the reader will pick up on it without being very Upton Sinclair-y about it.
I love it. Alexandra, you had a really interesting comment in the chat. Would you like to share that about obstacles and challenges?
Sure. Thank you for you guys' speeches. I'm generally curious if there are any obstacles or challenges you guys faced when publishing work that deals with climate change and nature.
So I have about maybe 10 or so flash fiction pieces I wrote a while back, kind of stemming from like Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. So here we go, big ideas, how do you like put them into the world? And for a while, it was hard for me to, this was early 2015, 2016, people were just starting to think about climate change a little bit, I think, in literary fiction. And it was starting to become more mainstream in literary journals. So for a while, people were like, these are good stories, but this is not a good. It is changing though. It's becoming a mainstream issue, and kind of nature literary magazines are popping up. Climate change magazines and climate change anthologies are popping up. So I think probably in the next 5 or so years, it will become even more mainstream, but there has been a bit of a progression. At least that's what I've noticed.
Great answers. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was going to say it's a little different in journalism because it's been an issue for decades now, and people have been I think there is a growing number of people who are writing about this, and I think there's also a lot more of a call for journalists to bring climate change and the environment into as many stories as possible. It's hard to talk about a lot of issues without also addressing climate change. I don't think that is necessarily happening across the board, but there are a lot of people arguing for it. Is it hard to get those kinds of stories published in journalism? No, it is not hard. I think the bigger challenge is trying to avoid repeating what has been said. Like as a freelancer, I am competing with all of the people who are on staff at different publications. And if I have an idea that is too similar to what a staff member might have, then that's not going to be accepted. So I have to look at different angles or know the publication that I'm writing for really well, like the type of thing that they want, and be able to give that as a freelancer. But there are so many publications now that are trying to cover climate and the environment, and I think doing it well. There could be more, like there could always be more. It's an issue everywhere happening over the entire planet. So like would I like there to just be a New York Times of nature and climate? Yeah, that would be awesome. But I do think we're starting to see more and more of it. And I think that's going to continue to grow just because it's obviously such a clear issue.
Great answer. Kimberly, anything?
Yeah, no, I would say that I haven't, as far as publishing work that deals with climate change and nature, I haven't quite experienced particular obstacles, but the ones I have experienced, I think, go hand in hand with the fact that I write primarily about, when I write about climate change or environment, it's fused with particular spaces and particular groups of people, namely people of color. I write about Mexican Americans, I write about Filipinos, I write about immigrants, I write about people from rural spaces or kind of, not necessarily upper class neighborhoods in big cities. And I think that those are, at least in my work and in my views, inextricably linked. Like if you're writing about a neighborhood like Fish Village in Galveston, that you're going to be dealing with a different group of people and a different set and perceptions of environmental challenges than you are if you're dealing with, the affluent families who live in River Oaks in Houston, right? It's a very affluent neighborhood. And actually, I'm thinking, I use that specifically because I heard on Texas Public Radio a couple days ago that there's a scientific study that's just been done looking at the impacts of different neighborhoods in Houston, like based on like socioeconomic status and the amount of trees that are located in each of those places. So just like the impacts of how a place like River Oaks has, however many tons of trees versus the A-Leaf neighborhood in Houston, which is much more diverse, much more low socioeconomic status, and how that impacts everything like air quality, weather, heat in Texas is a big deal, obviously, shade. So I think that at least in my work, publishing work that's dealing with these kind of places and these kinds of people has been a challenge. But it's one that I'd like to say is moving forward. Like there's now this demand for work by people like us, right? By people writing about these communities and from these communities. Whereas I think not very long ago, you'd have to be writing about, book agents in New York to get your work published. And now I think there's becoming less of a challenge and more of a demand for these places. So I'm hopeful too.
Great answers. I'm looking at the clock. We've actually gone through the entire hour. Seems like much less time. I want to thank all of the panelists. The opinions, the insights that you've offered have been wonderful. I'd like to thank the fellows for all the questions. I know this was really one of the most engaging sessions. But I do want to respect the clock, and we all have other things to do, everyone's time.